While having breakfast with his wife, a blind millionaire CEO laughs when a poor girl asks for food. He jokes, "Make me see, and I'll give you the leftovers." She prays, and days later, he regains his sight. Haunted by her words, he finds her in the streets and adopts both her and her little stray dog. Before we begin, tell me something about where you live. What's the weather like today? The morning sun cast its golden rays through the large windows of Cafe Milano, Manhattan's most exclusive breakfast spot, where billionaire CEO Richard Harrison sat with his wife Catherine at their usual corner table. At 55, Richard controlled a business empire worth over $2 billion, but for the past 3 years he had lived in complete darkness after a rare genetic condition had stolen his sight. "The stock prices are up another 12% this quarter," Catherine read from the financial report spread across their table, her voice carrying the practiced efficiency of someone who had become her husband's eyes in the business world. "The pharmaceutical division is performing exceptionally well." Richard nodded, cutting his eggs Benedict with the precision he had developed since losing his vision. Despite his blindness, he had refused to step down as CEO of Harrison Industries, relying on Catherine and his executive team to maintain his iron grip on the company. His success had only grown since his diagnosis, as if his other senses had sharpened to compensate for his loss. "Mr. Harrison," their regular waiter James approached discreetly, "there's a young girl outside who's been watching your table for the past few minutes. She appears to be homeless and looks quite hungry." Richard's jaw tightened with irritation. "Handle it, James. I don't want to be disturbed during breakfast." "Actually," Catherine interjected softly, glancing toward the window, "she's just a child, Richard. She can't be more than 8 or 9 years old. Catherine, we donate millions to charity every year. I don't need to be personally bothered by every street person in Manhattan." Richard's tone carried the cold efficiency that had made him one of the most feared businessmen in New York. Despite James's efforts to discourage her, the little girl pushed through the cafe's heavy glass doors, her worn shoes making soft sounds on the marble floor. She was thin, with tangled brown hair and clothes that had clearly been washed many times but remained stained from life on the streets. In her small arms, she cradled a tiny, equally dirty puppy. "Excuse me, sir," she said softly, approaching their table with a courage that seemed impossible for someone so young and vulnerable. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I was wondering if you have any food you're not going to eat. My puppy and I haven't eaten in 2 days." Richard turned his head toward the sound of her voice, his sightless eyes focusing somewhere just above her head. A cruel smile spread across his face as an idea formed in his mind. "You want food from me, little girl?" "Yes, sir, please. Just anything you can spare." "I'll tell you what," Richard said, his voice taking on a mocking tone that made Catherine shift uncomfortably in her seat. "You claim to want something from me? Well, I want something too. Make me see again, and I'll give you all the leftovers you want." The cafe fell silent. Other patrons turned to stare at this unusual confrontation between the billionaire and the homeless child. Catherine touched Richard's arm gently. "Richard, please." But the little girl didn't seem offended or discouraged by his challenge. Instead, she stepped closer to their table, clutching her puppy tighter. "What's your name, sir?" "Richard Harrison." "Why does that matter?" "Because I want to pray for you by name, Mr. Harrison." The little girl gently placed her puppy on the cafe floor, where it curled up quietly beside her feet, as if understanding the solemnity of the moment. She then reached out and, before Richard could react, placed her small, dirty hands on his shoulders. "What are you doing?" Richard demanded, startled by her touch. "Praying for you, Mr. Harrison," she said simply, closing her eyes and bowing her head. "Dear God, please help Mr. Harrison see again." I know you can do miracles because my mama told me so before she went to heaven. Mr. Harrison seems sad and angry, but I think if he could see all the beautiful things you made, he might be happier. Please heal his eyes and his heart. In Jesus' name, amen." The cafe remained completely silent during her prayer. Catherine felt tears welling up in her eyes as she watched this innocent child pray with such genuine faith for her often cruel husband. Even the other patrons seemed moved by the sincerity and purity of the moment. When the girl finished praying, she looked up at Richard with bright, hopeful eyes. "There, I prayed for you. God hears all prayers, especially from children." Richard sat stunned for a moment, not quite sure how to respond to such unexpected faith and kindness. That's very nice, child. But prayers don't change medical conditions." "My name is Hope," the girl said, picking up her puppy again. "And this is Buddy. We believe in miracles." Catherine, who had been watching this entire exchange with growing emotion, reached into her purse and pulled out a $20 bill. "Hope, there's a bakery just down the street. Why don't you go get yourself and Buddy some proper food?" "Catherine," Richard said sharply, "we discussed this." "No, Richard, you decided this. But I won't sit here and watch a hungry child walk away empty-handed." Catherine handed the money to Hope. "There's also a pet store next to the bakery. Get Buddy some puppy food and maybe a small toy." Hope's face lit up with pure joy. "Thank you so much, ma'am. You're an angel." "What's your last name, Hope?" Catherine asked gently. "I don't really have one anymore. When Mama died last year, I've just been Hope." "Where do you live?" "Wherever we can find a safe place to sleep. Usually in the park or sometimes in doorways when it's cold." Catherine felt her heart breaking. "How old are you, sweetheart?" "I'm 8 years old. Buddy is still a baby, maybe 3 months old. I found him in a trash can 2 weeks ago. Someone had thrown him away, but I knew God wanted me to save him." Richard listened to this conversation with growing discomfort. Despite his harsh exterior, something about Hope's unwavering faith and Catherine's obvious emotional response was affecting him in ways he didn't understand. "Hope," Catherine said, "I want you to promise me something. If you ever need help, really need help, you come back here and ask for Catherine Harrison. The staff will know how to reach me." "I promise, Mrs. Harrison, and I'm going to keep praying for your husband every single day." As Hope and Buddy left the cafe, Catherine turned to Richard with tears in her eyes. "Richard, how could you be so cruel to that child?" "I was simply pointing out the reality of the situation, Catherine. The world doesn't run on fairy tales and prayer." "Maybe not your world, Richard, but that little girl has more faith and hope than most adults I know, despite having lost everything." 3 days later, Richard woke up in his Manhattan penthouse with an unusual sensation. For the first time in 3 years, he could perceive something beyond the complete darkness that had become his reality. At first, he thought he was dreaming, but as he lay in bed, he began to make out faint shapes and shadows. "Catherine," he called out, his voice trembling with disbelief. "What is it, darling?" Catherine emerged from their walk-in closet, holding a business suit she had selected for his morning meetings. I think I can see something. Not clearly, but there's light. There are shapes." Catherine dropped the suit and rushed to his side. "Richard, are you serious? Look at me. Tell me what you see." Catherine studied his eyes carefully. For 3 years they had been unfocused and distant, but now they seemed to be tracking movement, following her face as she moved. "Richard, your eyes, they're different, they're focused, they're looking at me." Over the next several hours, Richard's vision continued to improve, gradually. By afternoon, he could make out faces, read large print, and see colors. Dr. Michael Stevens, his ophthalmologist, arrived at their penthouse within hours of Catherine's urgent call. "This is medically impossible," Dr. Stevens said after conducting a thorough examination. "The genetic condition that caused your blindness doesn't reverse itself. The damage to your optic nerves was permanent and irreversible." "But you can see that I'm seeing," Richard insisted, reading the eye chart across the room with increasing clarity. "I can see that your vision is returning, yes, but I cannot explain how or why. In 30 years of practice, I've never witnessed anything like this. We'll need to run extensive tests, but Richard, this appears to be what most people would call a miracle." As Dr. Stevens packed up his equipment, Richard sat in his study, staring out at the Manhattan skyline he hadn't seen in 3 years. The city looked different somehow, more vibrant, more alive, but as his vision cleared, his memory also became clearer, and he began to recall the events at the cafe 3 days earlier. "Catherine," he called to his wife, who was on the phone with his assistant, rearranging his schedule to accommodate the medical appointments. "That little girl at the cafe, Hope, she prayed for me." "Yes, she did. She prayed that I would see again." Catherine joined him by the window. "Yes, Richard, she did. And now I can see." "Yes, you can." Richard was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications of this connection. "I need to find her." "Why?" "Because I made her a promise. I told her that if she made me see again, I would give her food. But more than that." Richard paused, struggling with emotions he hadn't felt in years. "I need to thank her, and I need to apologize for how I treated her." "Do you really think her prayer caused this?" Richard looked at his wife, seeing her beautiful face clearly for the first time in 3 years. "Catherine, I've spent my entire career believing only in things I could measure, control, and predict. But I cannot explain what happened to me medically, scientifically, or logically. The only explanation that makes sense is the one that seems impossible." "And what's that?" "That little girl's faith was stronger than my blindness." The next morning, Richard and Catherine returned to Cafe Milano, hoping to find Hope in the area where they had first encountered her. Richard was still adjusting to his restored sight, marveling at details he had forgotten, the way sunlight danced on windows, the colors of autumn leaves, the expressions on people's faces. "There!" Catherine pointed toward a small park across from the cafe. "I think that's her." Richard followed Catherine's gaze and saw a small figure huddled against a large oak tree. Even from a distance, he could see that it was Hope, but she looked different, sicker, weaker than she had just days before. As they approached, they could see that she was shivering despite the mild weather, and Buddy lay motionless in her lap. "Hope!" Catherine called softly as they drew near. The little girl looked up, and Richard was shocked by what he saw. Her face was pale and gaunt, her eyes were glassy with fever, and she was clearly very ill. "Mrs. Harrison, is that really you?" "Yes, sweetheart, it's us. Hope, you don't look well." "I'm okay," Hope said weakly, though she was obviously anything but okay. "Buddy's been sick, though. He won't eat or play. I think he's really hurt." Richard knelt down beside Hope, his newly restored vision allowing him to see the full extent of her condition. She was malnourished, dehydrated, and burning with fever. The puppy in her arms was barely breathing. "Hope," Richard said gently, "I have something to tell you. Something amazing has happened." "What's that, Mr. Harrison?" "I can see. My eyesight came back. Just like you prayed for." Hope's eyes widened with wonder and joy, despite her obvious illness. "Really? God answered my prayer." "Yes, he did. And that means I owe you something. I made you a promise." "You don't owe me anything, Mr. Harrison. I'm just happy God healed you." Richard felt something break inside his chest, a wall he had built around his heart years ago. This child, who was clearly dying from neglect and illness, was expressing joy about his healing rather than asking for anything for herself. "Hope, When was the last time you ate? Yesterday, I think. Or maybe the day before. I used the money Mrs. Harrison gave me to buy medicine for Buddy, but it didn't help. And when was the last time you saw a doctor? I don't remember. We don't have money for doctors. Catherine and Richard exchanged looks. They both knew that Hope needed immediate medical attention. Hope, Catherine said gently, we want to take you and Buddy to see a doctor. Both of you need help. I can't pay for a doctor. You don't need to pay. We want to help you. Hope looked uncertain. Why would you want to help me? Richard took Hope's small hand in his. Because you gave me back my sight. Because you showed me what real faith looks like. And because, he paused, surprised by his own words. Because I think God put you in my life for a reason. What kind of reason? I'm not sure yet, but I know that meeting you changed something in me, even before my sight returned. Hope struggled to stand up, clutching Buddy protectively. Will they hurt Buddy at the doctor? No, sweetheart, Catherine assured her. We'll take Buddy to a special doctor for animals, a veterinarian. They'll help him feel better. And you'll both come with us? We'll stay with you the whole time, Richard promised. As they helped Hope to their car, Richard realized that this moment was changing him in ways that went far beyond his restored vision. For the first time in years, he was thinking about someone other than himself, and it felt more meaningful than any business deal he had ever closed. At Mount Sinai Hospital's emergency room, Hope was immediately admitted when the triage nurse saw her condition. Dr. Maria Gonzalez, the attending physician, pulled Richard and Catherine aside after her initial examination. This child is severely malnourished and dehydrated. She also has pneumonia and a high fever. If you hadn't brought her in today, she might not have survived another 24 hours, Dr. Gonzalez explained gravely. Will she be okay? Catherine asked, tears forming in her eyes. With proper treatment, yes, but she's going to need several days of hospitalization, IV fluids, antibiotics, and nutritional support. The question is, who's responsible for her care? Are you family members? Richard and Catherine looked at each other. No, we're not family. We just met her a few days ago. Then I'll need to contact Child Protective Services. A child this young can't be living on the streets alone. While Hope was being treated, Richard and Catherine took Buddy to the emergency veterinary clinic next door. Dr. Sarah Kim, the veterinarian, was equally concerned about the puppy's condition. This little guy is in rough shape, she said after examining Buddy. He's malnourished, has intestinal parasites, and what appears to be a serious respiratory infection. But he's young and strong. With treatment, he should make a full recovery. What kind of treatment? Richard asked. IV fluids, antibiotics, deworming medication, and proper nutrition. He'll need to stay here for at least 3 days. Cost is no object, Richard said immediately. Do whatever he needs. Dr. Kim looked surprised. That's very generous. Most people wouldn't spend this much on a stray puppy. This isn't just any puppy. He belongs to a very special little girl. Over the next 3 days, Richard and Catherine spent most of their time at the hospital, visiting Hope and checking on Buddy's progress. During their conversations, they learned more about Hope's tragic story. Her mother, Sarah, had been a single parent who worked 2 jobs to support them. When Sarah died in a car accident a year ago, Hope had no other family. Rather than entering the foster care system, she had run away and been living on the streets ever since. I was scared of the foster homes, Hope explained to Catherine as she slowly regained her strength. Mama always told me that God would take care of me. And he has. He brought me you and Mr. Harrison. Hope, Catherine said gently. What happens when you're discharged from the hospital? Where will you go? I guess back to the park. Buddy and I will be okay now that we're feeling better. Sweetheart, you can't live in the park. It's not safe, and winter is coming. God will provide a way. He always does. Richard, who had been listening to this conversation from the doorway, stepped into the room. "Hope, what if God's way of providing for you is through us?" "What do you mean, Mr. Harrison? What if we took care of you? What if you came to live with us?" Hope's eyes widened with surprise and hope. "You mean like a real family?" "Exactly like a real family," Catherine said, reaching for Richard's hand. "If you want that. What about Buddy?" "Buddy too," Richard assured her. "We wouldn't separate you from your best friend." Hope was quiet for a long moment, processing this incredible offer. "Mr. Harrison, why would you want to do that for me?" Richard sat down on the edge of her hospital bed. "Hope, you prayed for me to see again, and God answered your prayer, but you gave me something even more important than my eyesight." "What's that?" "You showed me what real faith looks like. You taught me that there are things more important than money and business success. You reminded me what it means to care about someone other than myself." Catherine added, "Hope, we've been married for 15 years, but we never had children. Maybe that's because God was saving us for you." Hope looked back and forth between Richard and Catherine, her young mind trying to comprehend the magnitude of what was being offered. "You really want to be my mama and papa?" "More than anything," Catherine said softly. "Then yes," Hope said, a brilliant smile spreading across her face. "Yes, I want to be your little girl." 6 months later, Richard stood in the beautifully decorated nursery of their penthouse apartment, watching Hope read a bedtime story to Buddy, who had grown into a healthy, playful golden retriever puppy. The room was everything a little girl could dream of: soft pink walls, shelves full of books and toys, and a canopy bed that made Hope feel like a princess. The adoption process had been completed just 2 weeks earlier. Hope Sarah Harrison was now legally their daughter, and their lives had been transformed in ways neither Richard nor Catherine could have imagined. "Papa," Hope called from her bed, using the name she had chosen for Richard. "Will you come tuck us in?" Richard smiled, still marveling at how those simple words could fill his heart with such joy. "Of course, sweetheart." As he approached her bed, Hope reached up and touched his face gently, just as she had that first day in the cafe when she prayed for him. "Papa, can you see me clearly?" "I can see you perfectly, Hope, and you're the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." "Even more beautiful than your business meetings?" she asked with a giggle. "Much more beautiful than any business meeting could ever be." Catherine appeared in the doorway, carrying a cup of warm milk. "How are my favorite people doing?" "Mama, tell Papa about the surprise," Hope said excitedly. "What surprise?" Richard asked. Catherine sat on the edge of the bed, her face glowing with joy. "Well, I got some news from the doctor today." "What kind of news?" "The kind of news that makes miracles seem even more miraculous." Richard looked confused. "Catherine, what are you talking about?" "Richard, I'm pregnant." The room fell silent as Richard processed this incredible news. After 15 years of trying to have children and being told it was medically impossible, Catherine was going to have a baby. "How is that possible?" he whispered. "The doctor said sometimes stress can cause fertility issues, and when that stress is removed, the body can heal itself. He thinks that the joy and love we've found with Hope somehow healed whatever was preventing us from conceiving." Hope clapped her hands with delight. "I'm going to be a big sister." Richard sat down heavily in the rocking chair beside Hope's bed, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the blessings that had entered their lives. "Hope, do you realize what you've done for us?" "What do you mean, Papa?" "When you prayed for me that day in the cafe, you didn't just give me back my sight. You gave me back my heart. You taught me how to love. You brought us together as a family. And now, because of the love you brought into our lives, we're going to have another baby." "God works in mysterious ways," Hope said with the wisdom of someone far older than her 8 years. "Yes, he does," Richard agreed, "and sometimes he uses little girls with big faith to perform his miracles." As they tucked Hope and Buddy into bed, Richard reflected on the incredible journey that had brought them to this moment. He had been a blind, cold, cynical businessman who cared only about profit and power. Now he was a father, a husband who truly appreciated his wife, and a man who had learned to see the world through the eyes of faith. "Hope," he said softly as she drifted off to sleep, "thank you for teaching me how to see. I love you, Papa," she murmured sleepily. 1 year later, Richard stood in the grand ballroom of the Harrison Foundation's new headquarters, watching Hope, now 9 years old, address a crowd of New York's most influential philanthropists and business leaders. In her arms, she held her 3-month-old baby brother, Samuel Richard Harrison, while Buddy sat obediently at her feet, now a magnificent golden retriever who had become her constant companion. "When I was living on the streets," Hope spoke into the microphone with remarkable poise for her age, "I learned that miracles don't just happen to make our lives better. They happen so we can make other people's lives better too." The audience of wealthy donors listened intently as this extraordinary child shared her vision for the Hope Foundation, the charitable organization Richard and Catherine had established in her honor. The foundation's mission was to provide housing, education, and medical care for homeless children throughout New York City. "My papa used to think that success was about how much money you could make," Hope continued, glancing at Richard with a loving smile. "But now he knows that real success is about how many people you can help. That's why we built this place, so other kids like me don't have to sleep in parks or go hungry." Catherine, who was sitting in the front row, wiped tears from her eyes as she watched her daughter speak with such wisdom and compassion. The pregnancy that had seemed impossible had progressed smoothly, and Samuel's birth had been another miracle in their lives. The baby had been born with the brightest blue eyes, just like his sister Hope. "The doctors said my papa would never see again," Hope said, her voice growing stronger. "They said my mama Catherine could never have babies. They said I would probably die on the streets, but God had different plans. He used me to heal my papa's eyes, and he used my papa and mama's love to heal my broken heart." Richard felt his throat tighten with emotion as he remembered the cynical, bitter man he had been just 18 months ago. Hope's faith had not only restored his physical sight, but had opened his spiritual eyes to see what truly mattered in life. He had stepped down as CEO of Harrison Industries 6 months ago, choosing instead to dedicate his life to philanthropy and his family. "Today we're opening the first Hope House," she announced, "where 50 homeless children will have warm beds, good food, and people who love them. But this is just the beginning. We want to open Hope Houses in every city, so no child ever has to wonder where they'll sleep tonight." The applause was thunderous. Richard watched as some of the hardest business people in New York wiped tears from their eyes, moved by the pure sincerity of his daughter's words. After the presentation, Dr. Michael Stevens, Richard's former ophthalmologist, approached the family. He had become not just Richard's doctor, but a close family friend, fascinated by the medical miracle of Richard's restored sight. "Hope," Dr. Stevens said, kneeling down to her level, "that was an incredible speech, but I have to ask you something I've wondered about for months." "What's that, Dr. Stevens?" "Ooh, when you prayed for your father that day in the cafe, did you really believe God would heal him?" Hope tilted her head thoughtfully, shifting baby Samuel to her other arm. "Dr. Stevens, my first mama, taught me that faith isn't about knowing for sure what's going to happen. Faith is about trusting God, even when you can't see how He's going to work. But you were so young, and your father was so difficult that day. I could see that Papa was hurting inside, even though he was mean to me. Hurt people sometimes hurt other people. But I knew God could heal both his eyes and his heart." Dr. Stevens looked amazed. "And now look what's happened. Your father can see your families together, and you're helping thousands of children." "That's how God works," Hope said simply. He takes broken things and makes them beautiful. As the evening wound down, Richard found himself alone with Hope on the Foundation's rooftop garden. Overlooking the twinkling lights of Manhattan, Samuel was sleeping peacefully in Hope's arms, and Buddy was stretched out beside them, content and peaceful. "Hope," Richard said softly, "do you ever miss your old life, before you became part of our family?" "Papa, that wasn't really living. That was just surviving. This is living, having people who love you, having a purpose, being able to help other kids who are scared and alone like I was. What do you think your first mama would say if she could see you now?" Hope was quiet for a moment, looking up at the stars. "I think she would say that God kept his promise to take care of me. And I think she would be proud that I'm taking care of other kids the way she took care of me." Richard pulled Hope closer, careful not to wake the baby. "You know, sweetheart, when I lost my sight, I thought my life was over. I became angry and bitter and mean to everyone around me. But God used my blindness to prepare me to see you, really see you, when you came into my life. God has a plan for everything, Papa, even the hard things. Yes, he does, and his plan brought us together as a family." As they sat together under the stars, Richard marveled at how profoundly his life had changed. The man who had once mocked a hungry child's faith was now dedicating his fortune to helping children in need, inspired by that same child who had become his beloved daughter. 2 years later, Richard stood in the bustling main hall of the Fifth Hope House, located in Chicago, watching Hope, now 11, teach a group of formerly homeless children how to train rescue dogs. The program had been Hope's idea, pairing children who had been abandoned with dogs who had been abandoned, creating healing bonds for both. "Remember," Hope instructed a shy 7-year-old boy named Marcus, who was working with a rescued beagle named Charlie. "Dogs can sense your feelings. If you're patient and kind with Charlie, he'll learn to trust you. And when he trusts you, you'll learn to trust yourself." The Hope Foundation had grown beyond Richard's wildest dreams. They now operated Hope Houses in 12 cities, had helped over 2,000 children find permanent homes, and had pioneered innovative programs combining animal therapy, education, and family reunification services. Catherine, now the Foundation's Director of Operations, approached Richard carrying 3-year-old Samuel, who had inherited his sister's bright blue eyes and gentle spirit. "The mayor of Los Angeles just called," she said excitedly. "They want to partner with us to open 3 Hope Houses there." "That's wonderful news," Richard replied, watching Hope help a teenage girl named Sarah teach basic commands to a rescued German shepherd. "But I think our daughter has even bigger plans." "What do you mean?" "Watch her with these kids. She's not just teaching them about dogs. She's teaching them about hope, resilience, and the power of unconditional love. I think she's going to change the world." As if she had heard him, Hope looked over and smiled, then jogged over to join her family. Buddy, now a dignified 4-year-old therapy dog, followed close behind, his official service vest identifying him as a certified companion animal. "Papa, Mama," Hope said breathlessly, "I have an idea for a new program." "What kind of program, sweetheart?" Catherine asked. "I want to create teams of kids and dogs who go to hospitals to visit sick children. Buddy and I have been visiting the children's cancer ward, and you should see how the kids light up when they see him." Richard wasn't surprised by this suggestion. Over the past 3 years, Hope had consistently demonstrated an intuitive understanding of how to help heal broken hearts and spirits. Her ideas had formed the foundation of many of their most successful programs. "That's a beautiful idea. Hope, how would it work? We could train kids who have graduated from our program to work with therapy dogs. They would understand what it's like to feel alone and scared, so they could help other kids who are going through hard times." Samuel, who had been listening to the conversation with the serious attention of a very bright 3-year-old, suddenly spoke up. "Hope, Can I help too? Hope immediately knelt down to her little brother's level. Of course you can help, Sammy. You have the most important job of all. What's that? You remind everyone that miracles still happen. You're living proof that God can create new life and new hope, even when people think it's impossible. Catherine felt tears welling up in her eyes as she watched Hope's natural ability to make everyone around her feel valued and important. The foundation staff often joked that Hope was the real CEO, since most of their best ideas came from her insights into what children needed most. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, the foundation's child psychologist, joined their conversation. Hope, I've been watching you work with the children today, and I'm amazed by your instincts. Have you ever considered studying psychology or social work when you're older? I want to learn everything I can about helping people, Hope replied. But I think the most important thing I can do is just love them the way God loves me. What do you mean by that? When I was living on the streets, I felt like nobody cared if I lived or died. But God sent Papa and Mama to show me that I was precious to Him. Now I want to help other kids understand that they're precious too. Richard listened to this conversation with growing amazement. At 11 years old, Hope possessed a wisdom and emotional intelligence that surpassed many adults. More importantly, she had maintained the pure faith that had first drawn him to her, even as she had grown and matured. Hope, he said, do you remember that day in the cafe when you prayed for me? Of course, Papa. That was the day my real life began. Do you ever wonder why God chose you to perform that miracle? Hope considered this question carefully. I think God chooses people who have been broken because we understand that everybody needs healing. When you've been hurt, you recognize hurt in other people and you want to help fix it. Dr. Morrison looked amazed. Hope, that's one of the most profound insights about trauma and healing I've ever heard. It's not really that smart, Hope said modestly. It's just what I learned from living it. As the day continued, Richard observed Hope interacting with children from all different backgrounds. Some who had been abused, others who had been abandoned, some who had disabilities, and others who had simply fallen through the cracks of the system. With each child, she demonstrated the same patient love and unwavering faith that had first captured his heart in that cafe 4 years ago. 3 years later, Richard found himself in the most unexpected place he could have imagined, standing on the stage of the United Nations General Assembly in New York, preparing to introduce his 14-year-old daughter as she addressed world leaders about child welfare and homelessness. Ladies and gentlemen, Richard spoke into the microphone, looking out at representatives from 193 countries. 6 years ago, I was a blind, bitter man who had lost his way. Today, I'm proud to introduce someone who not only restored my sight, but opened my eyes to what truly matters in this world. Please welcome Hope Harrison, founder of the Global Hope Initiative. The applause was thunderous as Hope walked confidently to the podium, now a poised teenager who had grown into her remarkable gifts. Buddy, now 7 years old and an internationally recognized therapy dog, walked beside her, his official United Nations visitor credentials marking him as the first therapy animal ever to address the General Assembly. Thank you, Mr. Secretary General, distinguished delegates and fellow citizens of the world, Hope began, her voice clear and strong. My name is Hope Harrison, and I'm here today not as the daughter of a wealthy businessman, but as someone who has lived the reality of child homelessness and who has dedicated her life to ensuring no child experiences what I experienced. Richard watched with overwhelming pride as Hope presented the Global Hope Initiative's plan to address child homelessness worldwide. The program, which had grown from their original Hope houses in American cities, now operated in 43 countries and had helped over 50,000 children find permanent loving families. 6 years ago, I was an 8-year-old girl living on the streets of Manhattan with my puppy Buddy, Hope continued, gesturing to the golden retriever who sat perfectly still beside the podium. I was hungry, sick, and alone. I had watched my mother die, and I had given up hope that anyone would ever care about me again. In the audience, Catherine sat holding 8-year-old Samuel, who was now old enough to understand the significance of this moment. Beside them sat Margaret Chen, Hope's honorary grandmother, who had become an integral part of their family after Richard had tracked down the elderly woman who had cared for Hope's mother during her final illness. But then something miraculous happened, Hope said, her voice growing stronger. I met a man who challenged me to make him see, and when I prayed for his healing, God not only restored his physical sight, but gave him the vision to see beyond his own needs to the needs of children like me. The delegates listened with rapt attention as Hope shared statistics about global child homelessness. But more importantly, she shared stories, real stories of children who had been transformed by programs based on love, dignity, and the belief that every child had inherent worth. The Global Hope Initiative isn't just about providing shelter and food, Hope explained. It's about restoring something that many abandoned children lose, the belief that they matter to someone. When a child knows they are loved unconditionally, they can overcome almost any obstacle. Richard thought back to the remarkable journey that had brought them to this moment. Hope's influence had grown far beyond their foundation's work. She had been featured on magazine covers, had written a best-selling book about faith and resilience, and had become a sought-after speaker at conferences worldwide. Yet she had remained grounded, humble, and focused on helping others rather than seeking fame for herself. Today, I'm announcing our most ambitious project yet, Hope said, her voice filled with excitement. The Global Hope Initiative is partnering with UNICEF, the World Health Organization, and governments around the world to create a comprehensive support system that will reach 1 million homeless children over the next 5 years. The applause was deafening. Richard could see tears in the eyes of hardened diplomats and world leaders who were moved by this teenager's passion and vision. But I want to leave you with the most important message of all, Hope concluded. Every child you help isn't just a statistic. They're someone's miracle waiting to happen. The child you rescue today might grow up to cure cancer, or lead a nation, or simply love their own children the way they were loved by you. When we invest in children, we invest in hope itself. As Hope stepped away from the podium, the entire General Assembly rose in a standing ovation that lasted for several minutes. Richard watched with tears streaming down his face as delegates from around the world approached Hope, wanting to learn more about her programs and her philosophy. Secretary General Maria Santos approached the family afterward. Mr. Harrison, your daughter has just delivered one of the most powerful addresses we've ever heard in this chamber. The passion and wisdom she demonstrated today will inspire action around the world. She's always been extraordinary, Richard replied. But what makes her truly special isn't her intelligence or her speaking ability. It's her heart. She genuinely loves every child she helps. And it shows. I've been in international relations for 30 years, and I've never seen delegates respond to a speaker the way they responded to Hope today. That evening, as the family celebrated in their hotel suite overlooking Central Park, Hope sat quietly by the window, looking out at the city where her journey had begun. "What are you thinking about, sweetheart?" Catherine asked, joining her daughter by the window. "I'm thinking about all the kids out there tonight, who are sleeping in doorways or under bridges, wondering if anyone will ever love them," Hope replied softly. And I'm thinking about how God can use anyone, even a scared little girl with a sick puppy, to change the world. If he can use me, he can use anyone. 5 years later, Richard stood in the rose garden of the Harrison family estate in the Hamptons, watching Hope, now 19, prepare for her graduation from Harvard University, where she had earned dual degrees in psychology and international relations. The young woman who had once begged for food scraps was now preparing to begin graduate studies at Oxford University on a full scholarship. "Papa," Hope said, adjusting the cap and gown that marked her extraordinary academic achievement. "Do you remember what you told me the day we first went to the Hope House? Remind me, sweetheart. You said that God had given me gifts not for my own benefit, but to help others. I've been thinking about that a lot lately." Richard studied his daughter's face, noting the serious expression that usually preceded one of her important announcements. "What's on your mind?" "I've been accepted to Oxford, and I'm grateful for the opportunity. But I've also been thinking about whether that's really where God wants me to be right now." Catherine, who was helping 13-year-old Samuel with his bow tie for the graduation ceremony, looked up with concern. "Hope, you've worked so hard for this opportunity. Are you having second thoughts about your education?" "Not about education, Mama. About timing. There are children who need help right now, today, and I keep wondering if I should be in a classroom or out in the field, actually helping them." Margaret Chen, now 93 but still sharp and actively involved in the Foundation's work, spoke up from her chair in the garden. "Child, what does your heart tell you?" "My heart tells me that knowledge without action is just academic exercise. I've learned enough to help people now. Maybe I should do that first and pursue more formal education later." Richard wasn't entirely surprised by this conversation. Over the years, Hope had consistently chosen service over personal advancement. She had turned down lucrative endorsement deals, had refused to profit from her best-selling books, donating all proceeds to charity, and had repeatedly chosen the harder path of direct service over easier alternatives. "Hope," Richard said carefully, "what specifically are you considering?" "The Global Hope Initiative has been invited to expand into regions affected by war and natural disasters. Children in refugee camps, kids displaced by conflicts, families separated by catastrophes. These are the most vulnerable children in the world, and they need help now." Samuel, who despite his young age had inherited both his sister's compassion and his parents' business sense, spoke up. "Hope, couldn't you do both? Study at Oxford and continue the Foundation work during breaks?" "That's what everyone expects me to do, Sammy. But those children can't wait for my academic schedule. They need help today." Dr. James Morrison, who had become the Foundation's international director, joined the conversation. "Hope, I've been coordinating with UNICEF about the refugee program. I have to tell you, the conditions are challenging. We're talking about working in areas with limited infrastructure, potential danger, and heartbreaking situations." "Dr. Morrison, have you ever known me to choose the easy path?" "No, I haven't, but I also want to make sure you're making this decision for the right reasons." Hope was quiet for a moment, then walked over to where Buddy was lying in the shade. At 12 years old, he was showing his age, but was still Hope's constant companion and co-therapist. She knelt beside him, stroking his graying muzzle. "Buddy and I have been partners for 11 years, she said softly. "We've helped thousands of children together. But Buddy's getting older and so am I. If we're going to make our biggest impact, it needs to be now." Richard felt his heart clench at the implications of what Hope was saying. "Sweetheart, are you saying you want to defer Oxford indefinitely?" "I'm saying I want to spend the next 2 years working directly with the most vulnerable children in the world. Oxford will still be there when I'm ready, but these children might not be." Catherine sat down beside Hope, taking her daughter's hands in hers. "Hope, you know we'll support whatever decision you make, but I need to know that you're not sacrificing your future out of some misplaced sense of obligation." "Mama, my future is helping children. Whether I do that with a degree from Oxford or with experience from the field. That's still my future. But right now, experience seems more valuable than classroom theory. Margaret Chen struggled to her feet and walked over to Hope. Child, when you were 8 years old and praying for your father's sight, did you think about whether you were qualified to perform miracles? No, Grandma Margaret, I just prayed because I believed God could heal him. And what happened? God healed Papa's eyes. Exactly. Faith doesn't require credentials, baby girl. And love doesn't need a diploma. Richard looked around at his family, his wife, his children, and the woman who had become their honorary matriarch, and realized that Hope had already made her decision. She was simply giving them the opportunity to support her choice. Hope, he said finally, if this is what you believe God is calling you to do, then we'll make sure you have everything you need to do it safely and effectively. Really, Papa? Really, but I have one condition. What's that? Promise me you'll come home for Christmas. Your old man needs to see his miracle girl at least once a year. Hope threw her arms around Richard, and he marveled once again at how this remarkable young woman continued to challenge and inspire everyone around her to live with greater purpose and compassion. 2 years later, Richard stood on the tarmac of Nairobi's international airport, watching a small plane taxi toward the terminal. After months of limited communication due to the remote locations where Hope had been working, she was finally coming home for an extended visit. The plane's door opened, and Hope emerged, looking tanned, lean, and somehow both older and more radiant than when she had left. Buddy, now 14 and moving more slowly but still devoted to his partner, walked carefully down the plane's steps beside her. Papa! Hope called out, running toward Richard with the same enthusiasm she had shown as a child. Richard embraced his daughter, struck by how much she had matured during her time in the field. At 21, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had faced real challenges and emerged stronger. Welcome home, sweetheart. We've missed you terribly. I've missed you too, Papa, but I have so much to tell you about what we've accomplished. Over the next few hours, as they drove back to Manhattan, Hope shared stories that were both heartbreaking and inspiring. She had spent 2 years working in refugee camps in East Africa, establishing Hope centers that provided education, medical care, and family reunification services for displaced children. The need is so much greater than we ever imagined, Hope explained, showing Richard photos on her tablet of the children she had worked with. But the resilience of these kids is incredible. They've lost everything, homes, families, possessions, but they still have hope for the future. How many children have you helped? Directly, about 15,000 over the 2 years. But we've trained local workers who will continue the programs, so the impact will reach many more. Richard studied the photos of Hope working with children who looked much like she had 11 years ago, dirty, hungry, scared, but somehow still hopeful. And how has this experience changed you? It's taught me that suffering isn't the end of the story, Papa. It's often the beginning of the most important chapter. These children who have lost everything are teaching me lessons about faith and resilience that I never could have learned in a classroom. When they arrived at the penthouse, the family reunion was emotional and joyful. Catherine had prepared Hope's favorite meal, Samuel had created a slideshow of family events she had missed, and Margaret Chen had made her famous chocolate chip cookies that Hope had been craving for months. Tell us about your favorite moment from the past 2 years, Catherine said, as they sat around the dinner table. Hope smiled, reaching down to pat Buddy, who was sleeping contentedly at her feet. There was a little boy named David in one of the camps. He was about 7 years old and hadn't spoken since he witnessed his village being destroyed. He just sat by himself all day, staring at nothing. What happened to him? Buddy and I started visiting him every day. I wouldn't try to make him talk or play. I would just sit beside him with Buddy, sometimes reading stories aloud, sometimes just being quiet. After 3 weeks, David reached out and touched Buddy's head. That was the breakthrough? That was the beginning. It took another month, but eventually David started talking to Buddy. Then he started talking to me, then to other children. Now he's one of the most talkative kids in the camp, and he's learning to read. Samuel, now 15 and already showing signs of inheriting the family's passion for helping others, leaned forward with interest. Hope, do you think you made a difference because you understood what it was like to be alone and scared? Exactly, Sammy. I could see myself in those children's eyes, and because I knew that love and faith could heal even the worst trauma, I could help them believe it too. Dr. Morrison, who had joined them for dinner, shared updates on the Foundation's global expansion. Hope, the programs you've established in Africa are being replicated in other regions. The model you've created is becoming the international standard for refugee child services. That's wonderful, Hope replied, but I keep thinking about what comes next. What do you mean? Richard asked. I've been thinking about the children who age out of refugee camps and assistance programs. The teenagers who are too old for children's services but too young and traumatized to navigate the adult world alone. Catherine recognized the tone in Hope's voice that usually preceded another ambitious project. What are you envisioning? Transition programs, places where older teens can learn life skills, receive education, and get psychological support while they figure out their next steps. Many of these kids have leadership potential, but they need someone to believe in them and give them opportunities. Margaret Chen, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. It sounds like you're talking about creating programs for young people like you were when you first started working with the Foundation. Exactly, Grandma Margaret. I was blessed to find Papa and Mama when I was young enough to be adopted. But there are thousands of older children who won't find families but still need guidance and support. Richard looked at his daughter with amazement and pride. Even after 2 years of intensive fieldwork, she was already planning her next initiative to help even more children. Hope, he said, do you ever think about taking time for yourself? Dating, traveling for pleasure, experiencing the things other young people your age enjoy. Hope laughed. Papa, this is what I enjoy. Helping these children gives me more joy than any party or vacation ever could. Besides, she added with a mischievous smile, I have been dating. The family looked at her with surprise. You have? Catherine asked. His name is Michael. He's a doctor with Doctors Without Borders. We've been working together in the camps. And? Samuel prompted with typical teenage curiosity. And he's wonderful. He shares my faith, my values, and my passion for helping children. He's also planning to propose soon. The room erupted in excited questions and congratulations. But Richard noticed that Hope seemed slightly overwhelmed by the attention. We'll talk more about Michael later, Hope said, deflecting further questions. Right now, I just want to enjoy being home with my family. 1 year later, Richard stood in the garden of their Hamptons estate, watching Hope, now 22, exchange vows with Dr. Michael Thompson in the most beautiful wedding ceremony he had ever witnessed. The guest list included world leaders, celebrities, and philanthropists, but it also included dozens of children from around the world who had been helped by Hope's programs. Do you, Hope Sarah Harrison, take Michael James Thompson to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, for as long as you both shall live? I do, Hope said, her voice clear and strong, her eyes shining with joy as she looked at her new husband. Michael, a tall, kind-faced man with gentle eyes and prematurely graying hair from years of working in challenging conditions, had proven himself to be Hope's perfect partner. He shared her faith, her passion for humanitarian work, and her complete dedication to helping the most vulnerable children in the world. By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride." As Michael and Hope kissed, Richard felt tears streaming down his face. The little girl who had prayed for his sight 13 years ago was now a woman, married to a man who loved her completely and shared her extraordinary calling. The reception was held in the same garden where Hope had announced so many of her ambitious projects over the years. As Richard walked through the crowd, greeting guests from around the world, he reflected on the incredible journey that had brought them all together. "Mr. Harrison," said Dr. Elizabeth Morrison. "Now, the director of the Global Hope Initiative, Hope and Michael, have asked me to make an announcement during the reception." "What kind of announcement?" "They're honoring you and Mrs. Harrison with a very special gift." Before Richard could ask for details, Hope and Michael approached the microphone that had been set up for speeches. "Thank you all for being here to celebrate this incredible day with us," Hope began, her wedding dress glowing in the late afternoon sunlight. "Michael and I are so grateful to have so many people we love sharing this moment with us. As many of you know," Michael continued, "Hope and I met while working with refugee children in East Africa. Our shared faith and our shared calling brought us together, and we're excited to continue serving together as husband and wife. But today, we want to honor the people who made all of this possible," Hope said, looking directly at Richard and Catherine. 13 years ago, my papa was a blind, angry man who had lost his way. I was a hungry, scared little girl living on the streets. God used both of our brokenness to create something beautiful." Richard felt his throat tighten with emotion as Hope continued. "Papa, you didn't just give me a home and a family. You taught me that our greatest blessings often come disguised as our greatest challenges. You showed me that love can heal any wound and that faith can overcome any obstacle. And Mama," Hope continued, turning to Catherine, "you showed me what unconditional love looks like. You welcomed a dirty, scared street child into your heart and your home, and you never made me feel like anything less than your precious daughter." Michael stepped forward. "Mr. and Mrs. Harrison, Hope and I would like to announce the establishment of the Harrison Institute for Child Advocacy, a new graduate program that will train the next generation of professionals to work with vulnerable children around the world." The crowd erupted in applause, but Hope wasn't finished. "The institute will be built here on the estate, and it will provide full scholarships for students who demonstrate both the academic ability and the heart to serve children in need. Our first class of 25 students will begin next year." Richard was speechless. This was beyond anything he could have imagined when he first encountered Hope in that cafe so many years ago. "But most importantly," Hope concluded, "this institute will be founded on the principle that changed my life and my papa's life, that every child matters to God, and therefore every child should matter to us." As the evening progressed and the celebration continued, Richard found himself standing alone for a moment, looking up at the stars. Buddy, now 15 and moving very slowly, but still determined to stay close to Hope, walked over and sat beside him. "You know, old friend," Richard said to the faithful dog who had been part of their family's journey from the very beginning, "when I lost my sight, I thought my life was over. I never could have imagined that blindness would lead me to the greatest blessings of my life." Catherine joined him, slipping her arm through his. "What are you thinking about?" "I'm thinking about miracles, about how God used a hungry little girl and a sick puppy to teach a bitter old man how to see what really matters." "And what really matters?" Richard looked across the garden at Hope and Michael, surrounded by children from around the world who were laughing and dancing and celebrating. He saw Samuel, now 16, deep in conversation with several teenage refugees about educational opportunities. He saw Margaret Chen, now 96, holding court with a group of distinguished guests, sharing stories about Hope's childhood. "What really matters," Richard said softly, "is love, faith, family." and the incredible things that happen when we open our hearts to let God work through us. As if she had heard him, Hope looked across the garden and caught his eye. She smiled and waved, the same radiant smile that had first captured his heart when she was 8 years old and praying for a miracle. Richard waved back, his heart full of gratitude for the journey that had brought them all to this moment. The blind man who had mocked a child's faith had become a man who could truly see. The hungry little girl who had prayed for a stranger had become a woman whose influence was changing the world. And it had all begun with a simple prayer, offered in faith by a child who believed that God could work miracles through the most unlikely circumstances. As the evening stars appeared overhead, Richard Harrison knew that the greatest miracle wasn't his restored sight. It was the love that had transformed his family and was now spreading to touch countless lives around the world. 10 years later, at 68 years old, Richard Harrison stood in the chapel of the Harrison Institute for Child Advocacy, watching his grandson, David Michael Thompson, take his first steps down the aisle as ring-bearer for another wedding celebration. Hope and Michael's son, now 3 years old, had inherited his mother's bright blue eyes and his grandfather's determined spirit. "Papa Richard," little David whispered loudly, causing the wedding guests to chuckle. "Is this where Mama got married too?" "Yes, buddy," Richard whispered back. "Right here in this same chapel 7 years ago." The bride today was Sarah Martinez, one of the first refugees Hope had helped in East Africa. Now Dr. Sarah Martinez, graduating from the Harrison Institute and marrying fellow graduate Dr. James Kim. The Institute had become exactly what Hope had envisioned, a beacon of hope that was sending trained child advocates to every corner of the globe. Hope, now 29 and pregnant with her second child, sat in the front row beside Michael, who had been named Director of Global Medical Outreach for the Institute. Samuel, now 23 and fresh from Harvard Law School, was already working on international children's rights legislation. "Dad," Hope had said to Richard just that morning, "do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had simply ignored me that day in the cafe?" "Never," Richard had replied without hesitation, "because I know now that God doesn't make mistakes. He knew exactly what he was doing when he brought us together." Margaret Chen, now 103 and still sharp as ever, had passed away peacefully the previous spring, surrounded by the family she had helped create. Her final words were, "Tell Hope that God's plan was even more beautiful than we imagined." As the ceremony concluded and the reception began, Richard found himself standing once again in the garden where so many important moments of their family's life had unfolded. Buddy had passed away 5 years earlier at the remarkable age of 17, but his legacy lived on in the hundreds of therapy dogs that were now part of Hope Foundation programs worldwide. "What are you thinking about?" "Papa?" Hope asked, joining him with little David perched on her hip. "I'm thinking about miracles, sweetheart, about how one little girl's faith changed everything." "No, Papa," Hope said softly, kissing his cheek. "One man's willingness to be changed by God changed everything. The miracle wasn't just my prayer, it was your heart becoming open to receive what God wanted to do through you." As 3 generations of the Harrison family stood together under the stars, Richard realized that their story was just beginning. The love that had begun with a desperate prayer in a Manhattan cafe was now reaching children on every continent, creating ripple effects of hope that would continue long after they were gone. "Thank you, God," Richard whispered, "for using broken people to do beautiful things." And somewhere in the gentle evening breeze, he could almost hear the echo of a young girl's voice. "Dear God, please help Mr. Harrison see again." The prayer had been answered beyond anything any of them could have imagined.